This Shabbat is a special Shabbat in that it has a name specifically attributed to when we read this week's portion. This week's portion is B'Shelakh, and so obviously we would call it Shabbat B'Shelakh, but it's also called Shabbat Shirah, the Shabbat of song, because we are going to hear, we're going to hear lots of songs today, but two songs in particular. We're going to hear the Song of the Sea that we're going to read as part of our Torah portion, and then we're going to hear the Song of Deborah as part of the Haftarah that Shimon is going to read for us. So this is called Shabbat Shirah. And just a little bit of context, right? We have now spent quite a few parshiot going through the Exodus from Egypt. We started Exodus, the book of Exodus, with the idea that there arose a new Pharaoh that didn't know Joseph. We see 400 years plus of slavery until we finally get to the Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt. And we read this week the Song of the Sea after we've gone through the Red Sea, the celebration. But what I want to actually focus on today is the very last section of this week's Parsha. Because one would assume that as we look at the last section, it tells us to remember our enemies. But it doesn't mention Egypt. One would assume that after 400 years of slavery, after everything that we went through in Egypt, that in the commandment to remember our enemies, it would mention Mitzrayim as one of those groups of people that we're supposed to think of and remember as our enemy. But it doesn't. The last little section of this week's Parsha starts on page 420, verse 8. It is the moment after we've left Egypt that Amalek attacks us. And it's a very short paragraph in comparison to everything that we've read about Egypt. And we have the commands, verses 14 through 16. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Inscribe this in a document as a reminder and read it aloud to Joshua. I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek under heaven." And Moses built an altar and named it Adonai Nisi. He said it means hand upon the throne of the Lord. The Lord will be at war with Amalek throughout the ages. So my question is, why? Why, after 400 years of slavery and persecution, did the Torah not say, remember what Egypt did to you? Now, it says it in a different way in different parts. It says, tell the story, right? It says every single year we should tell the story of all of this, but it's not a command this way. And as a matter of fact, if we look at Deuteronomy, right, we know, and we mentioned this a few weeks ago, we know that in Deuteronomy it reiterates, remember what Amalek did to you, Deuteronomy 25, but in Deuteronomy 23 it actually says, do not abhor an Egyptian because you are a stranger in his land. So the Torah is clearly differentiating between Egypt and Amalek. And the question is, why? What is the difference between Egypt and Amalek that the Torah says we're going to treat them differently?
I'm a little confused because I read the last line, but in the sense, in the case of Egypt, God did everything through his, prophet Moshe, who spoke to the people, but it was really God's miracles and God's strength. And with Amalek, it was the Jewish people rose up and were militarily successful. And so that's a difference, but it perplexes me because it says at the end that God will be at war.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would agree with you in that it says, if you read verse 13, right? Well, so if you read verse 13 alone, it says, Joshua overwhelmed the people of Amalek with the sword. But it's in the context of the previous verses, right? Which is that Moses was holding his hands up, and Moses invoked the presence of God as a support for that. So you could argue that in both cases, God worked through the people. In Egypt through Moshe, and here through Moshe as well, and perhaps Joshua. What else? What's the difference? Yes?
It's kind of interesting when they initially went down into Egypt, it literally saved the family, saved them from starvation, and they found a place there that they were welcome to, and it changed over time. But there's some commentary that says that Israelites were sort of willing to give up some of their freedoms in exchange for some of their security. So it was this long, drawn out,
It was. So yes, it was a long, drawn-out process, right? Israel, meaning Joseph and his family, ultimately, right? Joseph, because his family sent him there, sold him there, but his family, because there was famine, came to Egypt because they were trying to get away from the famine and the starvation, right? And so being in Egypt was a good thing in the beginning, at least until the end of the book of Genesis. Right? It's Exodus that it changed into something else.
I think the big difference here is Amalek it was almost like an ambush. They just showed up, like, there comes Amalek. And so I think the message is like to remember this, like remember there is always going to be an Amalek, and he says here, midor, not door, bidor, it's the whole thing. Whereas it's almost like the devil you know, the devil you don't.
Yeah, so Amalek, what you're starting to get to, and we'll dig into that a little bit more, what you're starting to get to is that Amalek responded a little bit differently. Amalek sort of ambushed them. And there's this idea that there's always going to be an Amalek. And Amalek almost becomes a symbolic enemy for the Jewish people. You could argue, though, that there's always going to be people who will persecute or try to, and Egypt could be that symbolic enemy as well. Yes?
So the phrase was always, "Amagimli Pharaoh Mitzrayim." We were slaves to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh is cast as the sort of pivotal figure in this. And the Egyptians, were not unkind for it. And look, they lent us their silver and gold when we were leaving.
They lent it to us? Yes, I know, I understand. I'm just questioning your term, they lent it to us, but okay. Well, but look, I think you actually, in the beginning of what you said, hit on something very important, right? Paro was the enemy, so to speak, right? And the people of Egypt were following along with what Paro did, and therefore the animosity, the enmity, is focused on Paro, is focused on Pharaoh, not necessarily the people of Israel, so much so that at the Seder, right, we take out a drop of wine because we're sorry that the people of Egypt had to suffer because of the leadership of Paro. We see that differently with Amalek. It's not the leaders of Amalek, it's Amalek. Right? It's everybody. It's all of Amalek was participating in this, and therefore the response is not directed at just one person, but the response is directed at the people who did this. And they participated in that. They were a part of that. Right? Yes?
I would say that God used Egypt to prove his power to the Jewish people, and rather than remember the negatives, to remember the miracles that happened in Egypt. Whereas Amalek, as you said, the whole of Amalek ambushed the Jews.
So yeah, I agree, Judy. I mean, God definitely used Paro and Egypt to show God's might. You could argue, well, why why was there that 400 years of slavery to begin with? Yes, the end was that, but why was there that 400 years of slavery to begin with? Couldn't it have happened a different way? Possibly. So, Rabbi Sachs picks up on something interesting in his book on ethics with all of this. He actually focuses on the reason that the antagonists attacked Israel. What was the reason that Paro and Egypt put the children of Israel into slavery?
Fear.
Fear of?
The multitudes, that they were growing, and fear of them rebelling.
Yes. Fear that the Israelites were getting too strong. It was Israel's strength that actually motivated Egypt to act. What about Amalek? Why did Amalek attack? Does it say that? It does. But who did Amalek attack? The weak. Right? The weak. It was the perceived weakness of Israel that inspired Amalek, or that had Amalek attacking, versus the strength of Israel that had Egypt attacking. So where do we go with that? As they say in the Talmud, my nafkamina, like what difference does that make? Does it make a difference for us? Whether or not it's weakness or whether or not it's strength that causes an enemy to attack.
If it's strength, you might say it makes sense politically, or some way back ways, and it doesn't. If you could kind of argue it, if you're attacking the weak, there's no way to justify it.
So Marge says that when you're attacking out of strength, you could argue that there is a political reason it makes sense, whereas if you're attacking the weak, it does not. I'm going to reframe it a little bit into the way that I think you and Rabbi Sachs are agreeing with one another. The way he puts it is, in today's terminology, he said the Egyptians were rational actors, the Amalekites were not. With rational actors, there can be negotiated peace. People engaged to conflict eventually realize that they're not only destroying their enemies, but they're destroying themselves. That is what Pharaoh's advisors said to him after the 10 plagues. Do you realize, it says in Exodus 10:7, do you not yet realize that Egypt is destroyed? There is the sense that, okay, we're in conflict, but at a certain point in time, we realize I have care for my own people as well, and I'm doing this for a reason, and when that reason goes away, the conflict goes away. When the reason goes away, the conflict goes away. And he quotes, for those who have this book, it's really an amazing book, it's called Essays on Ethics. He quotes a number of very interesting books, one of which I've read after 9/11, as we were trying to figure out why was this happening, right? Why was this happening? And he makes this distinction, these authors make the distinction between these rational actors and irrational actors. Because for a rational actor, yes, there's conflict, maybe it's territory, maybe it's something else, but when the reason goes away, when that's done, the conflict goes away. And Rabbi Sachs argues, and these authors argue, that in liberal, democratic, Western world, we have a hard time understanding the concept of irrational actors. We believe that everybody is a rational actor, right? And that an enemy is just somebody that we have to figure out how to solve that problem. But what Amalek represents is something different. What Amalek represents is, I'm going to destroy you because you are you. That's a different conversation. And they argue in these books that we have lost the concept in the Western world of the fact that there are people who consider others to be an enemy. We don't understand enemy. We talk about conflicts, we talk about different sides, we talk about all those sorts of things, but we really try to avoid in the Western world this idea of enemy, because an enemy is an irrational actor. It's an irrational thing. Why? What do you mean an enemy? An enemy means it doesn't matter what the conflict, it doesn't matter what the situation is. I'm going to fight against you because you are you. And they argued that one of the reasons that 9/11 took the United States and the Western world so much by surprise is because that was the motivation of the people who perpetrated 9/11. And yes, we try to say, well, but if the United States wouldn't have done this, and if the United States wouldn't have done that, or if the world wouldn't have done this, and we try to find a rational reason for it, but there really wasn't. And according to what they said, there wasn't. And I think what we're starting to see, if we haven't already realized that, is we're seeing the same thing with October 7th. And I was really sort of over the course of this week trying to figure out, is Hamas Egypt or Amalek? Right? How do we figure that out? Is Hamas fighting because out of fear of Israel's strength, right? Or is Hamas fighting this war because we are who we are? According to them and what they've said, it's the second. And our Torah actually tells us we respond to these different types of adversaries differently. We respond to these different types of adversaries differently. I don't know how to respond. I'm going to leave that to the people that are more adept than I am at prosecuting a war and prosecuting conflict and those sorts of things. But I think we, as Jews, need to understand that there isn't anything, according to Hamas, that Israel can do to stop the conflict other than not being there. And that's Amalek. That's Amalek. And while Rambam is very, very clear that the instruction to destroy Amalek no longer exists, and we can't assume that anybody is Amalek just because they're acting like Amalek, right? Amalek is a genetic and ethnic group. That doesn't mean, that's where this comes in, of don't forget that there are people who will act like Amalek, and we need to respond appropriately and in kind. Any comments or questions about this? I try to always focus in on the section of the Torah that we're reading, but I felt like it was so important as we get in what's going on in the world right now to hear these words and keep them in our mind as we're trying to move forward and figure out how to deal and recover from October 7th and how to continue to keep ourselves safe from an enemy that is still to this day saying the only solution to all of this is to have Israel gone.
I would just say the last verse there kind of comes at you with the world, overwhelmingly throughout the ages can seem daunting and like overwhelming and sad that we'll have to continue to deal with the reality of this. But it also is very, encouraging to me that the Lord will be at work.
Yeah, but we have the support. We have the support. It doesn't make it easier. Well, maybe it makes it easier. It doesn't take it away. But yeah, Yeah, I see that as something that is uplifting. We're actually going to talk a little bit about that in Zimrat Yah today, about how we're going to frame our song and our prayers in Zimrat Yah today. Yes?
There was one when I was reading the Parsha last night, I don't remember yesterday, reading that. There was a place where it said something about emunah, and that really like jumped out at me. And I think it was where they're holding the hands up. I don't remember, but specifically that word. And we hear that so much now going on with the reels that are coming out.
Yeah, it's verse 12.
About emunah, and I was like, some words, it's almost like it became bold and font, and I think that was a huge part of it. And then also, like you were sort of hinting at it, in the spirit of this being Shabbat Shira, is we also, while we can't forget Amalek, and we even say Yamach Shema, like we also have to remember to sing.
Mm-hmm.
And to have that, and I think that's what also helps give us that emunah.
Yeah, this moment comes in the same parsha as one of our greatest moments of joy, and it balances those two. It doesn't balance. That's the wrong word. It brings those two that we have to now deal with at the same time.
We live in both spaces.
Right? We live in both spaces. Yeah, I agree.
But we're getting better at it, I think.
Yes, sir.
Do you think that in handling opponents like Amalek, that we should just trust that God will be with us, or should we ask for God's help for us? Because it says that God will always be fighting Amalek. Does that mean that we need to ask for His help first, or should we just go about handling it and then trusting that He will be with us?
Well, so it's interesting. I mean, as we read through what happens here, right? As we read through what the actual battle of Amalek, we see both, right? We see God's presence there, but we see human beings doing things to bring God's presence, right? We see Moshe lifting up his hands and having the help of that, and we see Joshua actually going out and fighting, right? We don't sit back and say, okay, God, you're going to take care of it. But also, we don't just go out there and say, well, for sure God will be there. We do things to make sure that we recognize that and we honor that and we bring God into our lives. Otherwise, God isn't necessarily going to be with us in that way, right? Anything else? Yes, Micha.
Couldn't it be that the Hamas aspect, could be both? Yes, this way, and it's also that way too. And just Jews, historically, we've been punished because we're, quote, too powerful, and then also punished when we were too weak.
Right.
Israeli society right now is going through that whole self-examination.
Agreed.
Strengths and weaknesses.
Agreed. I think that is a good point, Michal, and that's why I still struggle to figure out how to define what it is that we're doing. And there may be a difference in definition between Hamas as the leadership, right? And if we say, well, it's the Hamas leadership and the people that are just coming along, right? Well, that's the Egypt model of Pharaoh with the people coming along. And we should fight Pharaoh and try to do what we can to support the people and be there and certainly be sad when those people are suffering because of the decisions of their leadership. Yet at the same time, we also struggle with the fact that, we know for a fact during October 7th, it wasn't just the fighters that came across, right? It was the people too. And they came across to loot and to rob and to do those sorts of things. And it's a struggle. Not everybody, of course, but it is a struggle. And I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer, which is why I brought it today. I don't know how I would define it, and I think you could make an argument either way. And you certainly could make an argument. I think what you were getting at is, Israel is not coming at this from a perspective of weakness, certainly from a military perspective. One could argue that Israel is coming at it politically from a perspective of weakness, but that's a whole different conversation. It's a whole different conversation. All right, let's begin. A lot of things to think about today, but most of what we are going to focus on is the Shirah, the crossing of the Red Sea, and that moment of celebration. And so we should take the time to celebrate that. And when we get to that particular aliyah, I will remind people of the special way that we read the Song of the Sea.